All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're joining from. Today, I am glad to be joined by an eminent group of experts to talk about the prospects and futures of the Quadrilateral Security Grouping. Quadrilateral Security Grouping is a grouping between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States to make Indo-Pacific more stable and resilient as a region. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who had been promoting the idea of an arc of prosperity, coined the larger grouping of coined the term quadrilateral as a geographical expression in the Indo-Pacific. And the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was quick to understand the value of the quadrilateral security grouping. And the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison also recently remarked when Quad was renewed as Quad 2.0 in 2017 that Quad is essential for a free and open Indo-Pacific. We also hear American President Joe Biden on March 12, 2021, recently talking about the importance of the quadrilateral countries and their cooperation on various aspects ranging from security to climate change to migration to technology to keep the region stable. And with the coming of American President Joe Biden, there was recently a meeting conducted between all of the four Quad leaders between these four countries with a renewed commitment to take this grouping forward. Now, we are faced with a number of questions when we are talking about Quad. The first one is, what is the pertinence of the grouping in the contemporary global geopolitical order? Why do we need a Quad right now? The second question is the potential areas of expanding cooperation among Quad countries. A question that is looming in front of all of the security analysts is, will Quad mature into an alliance? And how will Quad nations overcome their disparities and whether Quad is a cohesive entity? Finally, the question about the future of Quad and the potential of Quad in shaping the future of emerging geopolitical landscape around the world is something that remains to be answered. We are going to be talking about all of these things in our panel discussion today. Before that, I welcome you once again. Just to introduce myself, my name is Arpa Chaturvedi. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Global Policy Insights and a co-chair of the Quad International Diplomacy Forum. I'm also joined by four very eminent panelists from the United States of America. We are joined by Dr. Lydia Kostopoulos, who's an advisor for science and technology, especially emerging technology, at the Joint Special Operations University. Lydia's work lies in the intersection of strategy, national security, and technology. She's currently working for the US Special Operations Command, where her focus is on emerging technologies, and she has spoken at various eminent forums such as the United Nations, NATO. She has also participated actively in diplomatic programs in the US, Asia, and the Middle East. Lydia, welcome, and it is so nice to be speaking with you today.
Thank you.
From India, I'm joined by Ms. Jasmine Mehta, who is also the co-chair of the Indian Women in International Relations. She's currently based in London, and she's a fellow at Global Policy Insights. Jasmine also serves as the head ESG issuer for communications in MEA and MSCI to raise standards for sustainability disclosures and explain how investors can use ESG criteria in investment and decision-making. Jasmine holds a master's in capital markets, regulation and compliance from the ICMA Centre, University of Reading, UK, and is pursuing an executive master's in international strategy and diplomacy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Jasmine, welcome to the discussion. So nice to be speaking with you again over here.
Thank you, Arpit.
Thank you. And from Australia, we are joined by Anastasia Kapetas, who's the National Security Editor for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Prior to joining the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Anastasia was the advisor to the National Security College Futures Hub and an intelligence manager at Defense, working across a range of geopolitical, scientific, technical, and operational areas. And before working at Defense, she was the editor-in-chief at the Diplomat magazine. Anastasia, welcome, and so nice to be speaking with you today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
And finally, last but not the least, we are joined by Lauren Power, who's an adjunct professor at the Temple University, Japan. Lauren is an award-winning researcher, author, youth leader, and a migrant advocate. As a PhD candidate at the University of Tokyo, her work focuses on expatriate identity, mobility, social cohesion, and social structuralism. And while as an adjunct professor of global humanities at Temple University, she hopes to support the development of fresh ideas in the next generation. Lauren has been the head delegate of the American delegation to the G20 Youth Summit in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and was selected for the Global Dialogue Fellowship. She has also worked as a member of the editorial board of the Journal for Human Security Studies Special Edition and Refugee Review. Lauren, welcome, and we are looking forward to having a thrilling conversation with you.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. So I would first invite opening remarks from all of the speakers, and I would like to invite Anastasia to first talk about the prospects of Quad, especially how Quad can venture into developing greater cooperation around climate change and climate risk mitigation. Over to you, Anastasia.
Thanks so much, Arpit. I mean, the first thing I would say, you mentioned, why do we need the Quad? What are the geopolitical circumstances that make the Quad necessary? And for a lot of commentators, it's been geopolitical competition, essentially, has been the driving force. But I would argue this, is that we're seeing an unprecedented global environment with not just geopolitical competitive challenges, but also what we call non-traditional systemic challenges. And one of those is climate change. And this is existential for countries in the Indo-Pacific, and it demands huge efforts from Quad nations, but also from Quad friends in the region too. So Biden has put the climate change on the agenda. At the same time, he's elevated the Quad to be a head of country meeting. And so I think my remarks would be really around, in the first instance, what is that climate change agenda going to look like this year? We have COP at the end of the year, Glasgow, where most countries will be making much more ambitious commitments to net zero targets by 2050. The other thing that's happening is really Biden has directed the Pentagon to have a very hard look at climate and to essentially put together an unprecedented intelligence assessment on climate risk as well. So this is something that can really inform the Quad agenda. And I think in the first instance, what the Quad might be looking to do is to really harmonise cooperation between Quad militaries on climate. What might that look like? I think that in the first instance, we'd be looking at hardening military assets against climate change effects. So looking at basing and shipping, all of those kinds of things, how climate change might affect exercises that we do, for example. The other thing that might be interesting to explore is information sharing on weather and climate and effects on the maritime environment as well. All of our different nations have very different capacities that we could importantly share, but also look at how we might want to share those things with Quad friends in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, which is a deeply vulnerable region to climate change. On top of that layer, that basic layer of looking at what militaries are doing, it might also want to venture into trade, looking at how climate change might affect trade and the security of trade, but also in terms of looking at urgent mitigation action in the Indo-Pacific, looking at how to direct the massive amount of investment that is going to be needed for the region to make a successful transition to cleaner energy so that we can keep temperatures to 1.5, which is critical for the security of the region. After 1.5, lots and lots of cascading effects start to happen, which will lead to a whole bunch of very difficult effects that we probably won't be able to manage. At 1.5, we can still potentially manage these effects. Beyond that, it's an open question. So I might leave my remarks there for now, but happy to venture and dig deeper into this territory as we go on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anastasia. And I believe Jasmine also has her research around the broad area of geopolitics, climate change. And Jasmine, I would invite you to start with your opening comments, as well as perhaps comment on what Anastasia's talked about, the role of Quad countries in mitigating some of the climate risks that we are facing, and how important would be the cooperation between these four countries in improving or in averting some of the disastrous effects of climate change in the future. So over to you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Arpit, and great to be on this panel with our distinguished panelists, but also to be talking to this group today. So maybe a little bit of a recap, and this kind of could be a good segue to Anastasia's broader take on geopolitics and climate change. I think the Quad as a grouping is quite interesting to have that from a geopolitical lens. Again, keeping in mind the primary objective is to ensure that through Quad, or what is for an open sort of Indo-Pacific, ensuring that lines of communication are available and accessible to all. Of course, that zone is or Quad's activation or recent reactivation has been quite on the back of some of the activities that we've been seeing in South and East China Sea, and sort of as a response to that. But I think in general, and to again Anastasia's point earlier in March, the conversation with the head of state for Quad basically opened the chapter, beyond traditional sort of security dialogue into spaces around climate change. And encouraging, the four countries to work on it. And I actually want to pivot the dialogue a little bit into the space regime and sort of the collaboration that has been going on, the space efforts, which has been more so bilateral in nature between the four countries. But again, climate change is a big aspect. Is some of the joint projects that India and India's ISRO and US NASA have been working on is to launch certain satellites to be able to better capture imaging from a climate change perspective, especially when we're looking at a lot of the glaciers and the Himalayas in India and the impact of that on climate change. And that has actually been work in progress for the last, I believe, 6 to 8 years now, and we will hopefully see some of these sort of launch more formally as satellites in the times to come. Again, India has had those initiatives with the Australian government and also with Japan recently, earlier this year. So there's a lot that's going on in the sort of the broader space remit that is, again, perhaps linking on the technology aspect, but is, targeting climate change as sort of this transnational issue that we're all facing, again, from an information sharing perspective. That appears to be, again, something that is taken up on high priority, again, for the Indian government on account of a lot of the physical impacts of climate risk and climate change that we're undergoing and experiencing. So that's my initial, quick comment here on sort of introducing the whole space aspect from, again, information sharing perspective and linking it back to climate change. I'll pause there.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Jasmine. And, what I'm hearing from Anastasia and Jasmine is that I get a sense that Quad has a great potential to be a security grouping which can look at security beyond the traditional terms. We can look at things such as human security, such as technological cooperation, as Jasmine also pointed out, cooperation in the space. And here, I'd like to bring in Lydia to deliver her opening remarks and also talk a little bit about the role of technological cooperation amongst the four Quad countries, especially given the fact that emerging technologies are set to add about $15 trillion to the global economy by 2030. And what do you think Quad countries can contribute to that through their mutual cooperation? So over to you, Lydia.
Thank you. I think that there's so much to say about how systems thinking is the way that we need to approach this. So from where Anastasia was talking about to say that it's climate change, but it's national security, it's maritime security, and then Jasmine talking about space and information sharing, it's all of the things together. And so, for example, in the latest ODNI report, Global Trends 2040, they talked about food security and water scarcity. These are things that are critical to national security. And if we think about the Quad countries and we look at how climate change is impacting every, with India, for example, having heat waves becoming more severe, heavy rain events that have increased threefold since 1950. In Australia, the hot days are becoming hotter, sea levels are rising, and the oceans are becoming more acidic, which affects the fish production. Snow depths are declining, extreme rainfall is increasing in Japan. The temperature is rising faster than the global average in Japan. Few people know that. The number of days with high temperatures are increasing over there. This is already affecting their ability to produce food in the ways that they did in the past. And then in the US, it's the same thing. We've got a drought frequency, a severe precipitation, we have fires. This affects national security at an economic level, at a stability level. It also, though, affects our ability to produce food and our reliance on the existing agricultural front. So from that perspective, we also have to think about that if we do not leverage the promise of these new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and sensing. So, for example, in agri-tech, agricultural technology, they have now sensors that can see the moisture. They use space to see how the land is doing. But then you also have vertical farming technologies and less water than before and create more food. I think that the Quad countries have an opportunity to collaborate on this space that it may not initially seem traditionally part of national security, but climate change is slowly becoming something that is considered part of national security. If we don't deal with that, we're going to see mass migration, and that could be quite detrimental. And the other item I think that the Quad has an amazing opportunity to collaborate on is maritime security, which Anastasia also touched on. Maritime security also impacted by climate change, and space also can be a great tool there too. But to just kind of recap the maritime security threats, it's, privacy, smuggling, illegal immigration. It's also safeguarding our trade vessels as they go from one destination to the other. It's terrorist attacks and environmental disasters that also affect our shipping containers. And so here's another opportunity for collaboration and cooperation using technologies. And as Jasmine was saying, information sharing. We have an opportunity to leverage the data that we are all collecting together and share that so we can have a better situational awareness. So I think I'll put my remarks there.
Thank you. Absolutely, Lydia. And I think, the kind of opportunities in terms of information sharing and just, through joint Quad exercises, increasing interoperability between, cooperation on information sharing or cooperation on climate change is something that is going to be really, really important. You brought a very important point over here about climate change leading to increased migrations and that being connected to national security. And over here, I want to bring in Lauren, who's joining us from Japan. And Lauren, since your work is in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, and a lot of your work is focused on migration, in addition to your opening remarks, I'd love to hear from you about what can these 4 Quad countries and also other countries in Southeast Asia or the APAC region do in order to make migration more regularized and overall reduce the negative effects of irregular migration, which can lead to various national security challenges, considering the fact that 65 million international migrants have been in the Asia Pacific region since 2019, and 70% of foreign-born migration takes place in Asia Pacific overall. So over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Arpit. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'll begin with opening remarks, and then I'll speak to the issue on migration, perhaps in a bit more detail toward the end. Firstly, Japan has remained a dedicated supporter of the Quad. As you pointed out, it was a Japanese Prime Minister Abe that coined the quite apt and catchy, I believe, and very much relevant. This year, the Quad has emerged not only as a representation of balance and strength and growth, but also a very real and multilateral partnership that can amplify opportunities for economic prosperity, as well as stability and security, and also to cooperate to address some of the most pressing issues, both in Asia and globally. And climate change is definitely one of those that we're seeing emerging in a very strong way this year. And we saw this capability, as was mentioned by Anastasia, in March with the formation of not only on climate change, but of course, also very relevantly on COVID-19 vaccines within the region. This region of Asia Pacific has a great disparity in terms of vaccine distribution. It's something we can see addressed by the Quad countries to provide a bit more equity there. Under a Biden presidency in the US, I believe we can see alignment of ideals that can hopefully facilitate deeper engagement on issues beyond the scope of security and maintaining slack lines and so forth. Additionally, in the Quad, of course, Japan remains committed to free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan being a maritime, is heavily dependent on sea lanes for trade with the world. And the US and Japanese militaries have a long-standing history of cooperation, especially with the American 7th Fleet being based here. I believe that it's worth mentioning that Japan historically and still now is cautious of China's imposition of certain economic conditionalities, and also of offering certain alternatives to ASEAN countries and Southeast Asia more broadly. And I believe that there have been several commitments ongoing this year for certain types of Quad collaborations, especially for different kinds of supply chain safeguarding and infrastructure on top of maritime concerns. Regarding migration, I would just say that, the Quad comprises economically robust countries in the region, and these are traditionally known as destination countries for migration. We were lucky to have the first Asia-Pacific review of the Global Compact for safe, orderly regular migration. We just call it the GCM for short. It's quite a long name. And in that review, what we found, the GCM adopted in 2018, and over the past few years, we have found basically, inconsistent application. This is very much a growing commitment, and there's a building and knowledge sharing that came forward during the review. We did see was a renewed commitment to human securities, especially for some of the more vulnerable groups in Asia Pacific. And this came forward not in opposition to concerns of sovereignty and rights, but rather as an awareness of an ethical commitment and a commitment to the reality. As you pointed out, we are characterized very much by and very right by it in many ways. Especially, in light of the situation in Myanmar and more broadly forced migration and internal displacements due to security and climate crisis, I hope that we can see an enhanced potential to intercede at both the national and international levels. So I believe this expansion of scope that we're seeing this year is a very promising sign, and I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lauren, for those opening remarks. And one thing that I want to pick out from what you mentioned is about supply chain resilience. And I invite all of the members of the panel to comment on this a little bit, because with the raging of COVID-19 all across the world, there has been a lot of supply chain disruptions. And suddenly there's been a great concern amongst the private sector companies about diversifying their supply chain and creating various networks so that in the face of future crises such as this, supply chains don't break down all of a sudden. Just wanted to hear if one of us or a few of us can comment on how can Quad countries and how can other countries which can cooperate with Quad countries contribute towards greater supply chain resilience for the future?
I could say a few words. I think that first of all, as you mentioned, COVID was really a stark reminder that we should not just keep our supply chains the way they are, that we need to have redundancy within them and resilience. Ways to do that are to make sure that there are more than one place for each part of that chain. But in addition to that, technology can help here. When we think about digital manufacturing, this is one way to exchange intellectual property that can be manufactured in a faster way between countries, but also in a way that where if one place cannot physically produce it, you can just email those CADs or any other files that are needed, and another location can print them immediately. Yeah. So that creates a lot more resilience in the case of, for example, another pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I mean, the things that I'm hearing is that you essentially just transfer the intellectual property over there, and you can print, everything from a tank to a whole building. So,
well, these days it's actually really interesting because if we think about the population growth among the Quad, one of the things that is necessary is more housing, more buildings. And actually 3D printing can deliver that. There's many new technologies in that space. So you could, for example, email the house file, but you would need to have the cement 3D printer that could do it and the know-how on the ground as well. But these are things that can be done through training remotely or even sending a team over. But these are more agile systems than the traditional factories and manufacturing from last century, where it's something that was far more physical in nature, a lot more people involved, and harder to change around. Versus when we look at digital manufacturing, it's easier to put it in one place and in another place and another place faster.
Right.
And if I could jump in, I think that's a great point, Lydia, around transfer of technology in IP in the process for sort of building more capacity and making the supply chains resilient. I think what goes in hand is also investments in sort of those specific projects in other countries to be able to balance that. And we've seen a slight uptick, within Quad countries for such kind of investments. Whether you talk about, India and Australia, India and Japan, and India and the US, but that has more so been bilateral. I mean, there is sufficient scope to have more economic, sort of strategic economic investments hand in hand with sort of focus on technology within the Quad group.
Yes, I think I'd just like to underline that point. I mean, the Quad is likely to look at that intersection between security and trade and economic investment and growth. And of course, one of the big areas is technology itself, because technology is, seen to be a key site of geopolitical competition. Biden's the US Senate's just approved a massive spending package, sovereign investment into US technologies, particularly in digital AI. So I think these are the kinds of things that also will be talked about in the Quad, and also sharing from a military point of view. How do our militaries, share and cooperate, and military applications too.
Certainly. Go ahead, Lauren, please.
I just wanted to expand a bit on the concept of supply chain mobilities to include certain types of human mobilities, which of course we saw quite interrupted during COVID as well. This was, I think, a very disruption in a lot of different types of business. And we've seen a lot of economic sort of, I would say, statements being made by different chambers of commerce and other sorts of governments trying to elicit from this and human mobility upon which so much transactions have been traditionally reliant. And using digital technologies to overcome these things has been it's been a pretty startling thing for all of us. Experienced some degree of that in our own lives, our own working lives. But we have seen a lot of people be greatly affected by this. And so I believe that part of the resilience that we might see evolve over time might come in the form of what do we do about people movement? this? To what degree can we justify these types of containment measures being taken to limit the mobilities of people during such times?
Certainly, Lauren. And just to build on what you have said and the others have said in the panel, what I'm gathering over here is that there are things such as technological transfer that can also have various impacts on other motives of the Quad grouping, such as climate change, such as improving the state of human security, such as migration. I want to delve a little bit more into the aspect of climate change over here, considering the fact that Indo-Pacific as a region is a place which not only houses, it's home to a majority of the Earth's population. It is also, a region where, you have, if you count in the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific, it has a lot of maritime, but trade as well as, a lot of, life under the water. And my question over there is, to Anastasia, that we were talking about the role of Quad countries as well as the role of their individual naval forces in ensuring better practices towards averting the negative impacts of climate change or biodiversity loss and things like that. Could you talk a little bit specifically about what can these countries as well as their naval or armed forces do in order to reduce emissions, reduce the loss of biodiversity, and overall keep the natural ecosystem in the Indo-Pacific more pristine and intact?
Yes, and look, that's one of the things that the Pentagon is doing a big assessment on at the moment, because it's the largest military in the Quad. It has a really big and a substantive footprint, carbon footprint. So it's actively looking at ways of switching over, for example, basing energy to renewables. It's also looking at really cleaning up all the inevitable kind of chemical and other waste that big military bases usually kind of emit as well. So there's an environmental impact as well. I mean, the other thing the Quad can do is have a look at how it might safeguard the fisheries of the future. And for example, Australia has a long-standing program providing patrol boats, for example, to the Pacific to help the Pacific safeguard their fisheries. And it's a massive task and we need more resources. But because I think fisheries are going to become a really existential issue, particularly again in Southeast Asia, where fisheries provide so much of the protein to populations there. Right. Ocean acidification is one issue, but ocean warming is sending fish further north as well. So safeguarding maritime incursions on fisheries might be something that the Quad wants to talk about as well.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And now I want to, unless somebody else has any comments about the climate change aspect of it, I want to move very quickly into the geopolitical angle of Quad. And here I'd like to bring Jasmine in, and I'd like to understand, Jasmine, the role of India, which happens to be a very different sort of an economy if you look at the other Quad countries, because if you look at Australia, if you look at Japan, if you look at the United States, all have the status of a developed country per se, while India is still a developing economy. Even though majority of the predictions look like that India is going to be an economic superpower, it's right on its way. Now, given the fact that in terms of its demographics, in terms of its status of development, what do you think India brings to the table when you talk about a grouping like the Quad Alliance, and how does it contribute to the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific over there?
Absolutely. I think it's a very interesting question, and the fact that proximity, right, in terms of where India is positioned in the Indo, it's it's its biggest contributor, but it can also kind of backfire at some point in time if geopolitical risks aren't managed properly. And that kind of remains one of the inherent contributors that India has to the Quad Forum in total. In terms of sort of the economic status or the economic power status that India has, sure, I think it definitely has a way to kind of get onto the developed status. However, the fact that it is the second most populous country, there are a lot of scope or opportunities for supply chain alternatives that are available to the rest of the Quad countries, and also kind of extensive collaborative opportunities that India specifically has from a trade perspective, and the fact that it is to some sense an alternative to in all these aspects to the existing landscape or the existing kind of dependencies that the rest of the Quad countries have within East Asia is one of its biggest contributing factors, but also where India stands to benefit the most, and where it can kind of work this into its social, and economic development.
Certainly, and I absolutely agree with you when you're saying that given the proximity, given the geopolitical situation that India is in, it is. India probably has a lot of stake in Quad as a security grouping succeeding, and it also has with the improving economy and greater sort of moving away from the non-aligned movement, and then getting into veritable security alliances. It has a lot to contribute over there as well. Let me bring in Lauren over there and talk about the geopolitical situation, because in a way, Quad would be, a lot of people speculate whether Quad would contribute to, changing the balance of power in the world, or Quad would. A lot of people talk about Quad, whether it will emerge as a cohesive entity or whether it will emerge into an alliance. Right now, it's just a loosely bound umbrella term and a loosely bound security grouping. My question over there is that what do you think will hold Quad together, and what would be the geopolitical importance of Quad as a grouping?
Well, I'd speak to that. I think that the Quad naturally emerged at a moment when these four countries were quite geopolitically aligned in many ways. In addition, within the region, India, Australia, and Japan were quite standout each by each, but in common, they shared a robust economic growth trajectory. Japan already having been quite established and so forth. But I think that what we might see in terms of any sort of, we might say, would be perhaps the inclusion of some certain rising countries. And why not? We see in ASEAN blossoming and really flourishing. And over time, this is something that we should be celebrating. And I think that ASEAN countries that are rising, in part due to economic partnership in terms of RCEP forward, I think why not to include these different partners? Anastasia and I were speaking briefly before the panel, and it was also saying that perhaps Korea might decide to join in. I think that the Quad is a catchy name, but why not expand to include 5 or 6 as appropriate? Quad as a grouping doesn't exist in opposition to any other particular groupings within the region. I think that it is a timely and important alliance, unofficial as it is. I don't know that the way forward is to solidify that alliance into a bordered thing, but rather to be a more inclusive cooperative that can expand to include others as they rise to the occasion, so to speak.
Certainly. And just a follow-up question over there, and this is for Lydia or for anybody else to answer that. why did we talk about, like, why is there so much revivification of Quad now? Like, what happened in the past 2 to 3 years that there was again a talk of the re-emergence of Quad, and why are we talking about cooperation between these 4 countries first, and perhaps not the others to begin with? I absolutely agree with what Lauren said, that it should be a concept, or it should be, while it's called Quad, it should be open to other countries, and perhaps Korea would join in, perhaps other countries might also join in. What's, on a historical timeline, what do you think is the reason for the revivification of Quad right now?
Well, I think I would echo what Lauren said, that I don't know that this is something really around borders, but I do see it around interests. And so perhaps there are more maritime security interests where there are new spaces. And now with the new administration in the US, all of these things are looked into again. And the administration's reaching out to different countries to explore what new opportunities there are. I would also like to add to what Lauren said about how this could be open to other countries, and it could also end up including other things. So initially it may have started as maritime security. It could later on evolve into a potential digital economic trade bloc in 20 years, or it could even emerge into a way to do business with countries in between each other, perhaps like the e-Estonian model for e-residency, but something where businesses in, for example, digital manufacturing are able to have reduced tariffs between these countries or something like that. So I think there's so much opportunity there that does not need to be limited to borders.
Certainly. And over there, I think, this is a question open to everybody. I'm still, trying to find the answer to the question that what holds the 4 Quad countries together? What's like the underlying logic? Because we've seen a number of groupings coming up throughout history, and only a few of them have survived the test of time. We've seen, I particularly feel, I remember in one of my international political economy seminars back when I was in my master's program, we discussed how SARC failed to come up as a, formidable geopolitical grouping because there was hardly any unity, or there was hardly, any common denominator that kept SARC together. Is that, would we predict that could be a potential fate for Quad, or what do you think is the reason d'etre for that? Anastasia or Lydia? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just jump in very, very quickly. About 10 years ago, I remember when I was the editor-in-chief of The Diplomat, we were reporting it on those who were agitating for Quad. And, most commentators thought it was a stupid idea. There was no need for it. So what's changed since then? And I think it is really about geopolitical competition. It's a different attitude from certain regional players that all of the countries in the Quad have kind of felt the brunt of as well. So I think really what drives the Quad is still that geopolitical calculus. And again, it's very careful not to be a formal grouping. It's very careful not to position itself as a NATO of the Indo-Pacific, to be really just an informal alliance of like-minded nations. Democracy promotion is kind of key and very central to, I think, the ethos of the Quad. So it's really about, like-minded systems getting together to safeguard the things that they hold very important, like a free and open Indo-Pacific, to safeguard rules-based order around trade and the rules of geopolitical rules of the road. So, yes, I think it will endure as long as that geopolitical competition lasts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because, a few days ago, we held a panel discussion on Quad at my think tank, Global Policy Insights, and there was a lot of debate on, whether Quad is just an instrument to deal with the geopolitical competition, and will it dissipate as soon as the geopolitical competition dissipates. And I seem to gather your perspective that indeed, it is the geopolitical competition that has been the stimulus for Quad, and it's going to thrive as long as the competition remains. Any other views in this?
Maybe I can quickly jump in. So I think my approach is slightly different. I think for any grouping that has taken place so far and formally called itself as an alliance, have had some kind of push and pull incentives. And I use this very carefully because your push incentives are these sort of national security interests that are sort of the main drivers for sustaining a particular kind of alliance and for that to have a longer life cycle. And on the other side, you have some of these pull incentives around economic, integration, sharing resources, and sort of the broader issue around, or the broader objective around cooperation. So right. it does appear at this point in time that there is a significant work to be done within the Quad, and all 4 countries are slowly and steadily finding more areas around pull incentives. But in the future, if we see some kind of a formal alliance of this, it will predominantly be on the back of some push incentives around national security.
No, certainly, and I think one of the incentives over there, which might just sustain even beyond the geopolitical competition, is what Anastasia said, is the common denominator of these countries' commitment to promote a rule-based international order, democracy in the world, etc., etc. I saw that Lauren wanted to come in over there. You unmuted yourself and you wanted to comment on the question. So Lauren, over to you.
I did. I deferred to Jasmine, but I will make a comment as well. After 8 years in TPP development, the United States did end up pulling out of TPP. And I think that was a moment where perhaps there was a bit of longing on the part of some Asia-Pacific countries. And I think one reason why we might be seeing an added attention to the Quad is not necessarily just about geopolitical positioning, but perhaps also about maintaining those kinds of close ties to economic potential and regard as well, because I think that the Quad, although it is an informal grouping, it is still a titled grouping, is still a somehow official, not formal. And I think that, having the United States involved in the region in this capacity is also meaningful, not only for the United States, but also to the region. And so for this, I think that the Quad is meaningful. I don't know that we need to see it, flourish into something formal necessarily for it to maintain that standing as something that can potentially endure, not if for no other reason than because it's adaptable. It is informal. It can adapt and adjust to these sorts of things, unlike TPP, which the rigidity of that very formal agreement was partly why it ended up changing as it did and the U.S. left it, I do believe. I think that this is one of the benefits of Quad.
Certainly, and Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to agree with Laura. And I think one of the things that's really important about the Quad is that real longing for the US to come back into the region. Kind of as long as I've been looking at the region, certainly the last decade, there's been so much, hand-wringing and heart-burning about the US's lack of attention to this particular part of the world. And to see, this administration really come back and put partnerships at the top of their foreign policy and security agenda, I think has really reassured a number of nations.
Repivot to Asia.
That's right. So great symbolic politics.
Absolutely. And, one other thing that I'm sort of gathering from what Lauren said, and earlier, Anastasia, you also mentioned, was that the informality, not putting a formal architecture around it, is perhaps deliberate and perhaps strategically sound, given the current geopolitical situations and given the history of TPP and other agreements, as you earlier said, Lauren. We have a question coming from Kenneth Pope in the chat box. And Kenneth is asking us that other than Korea, would Indonesia be a logical addition to Quad? It has a huge population and could be a vital member. Any takes on that?
I would just say that Indonesia's foreign policy have really been at pains to be as non-aligned as possible.
Mm-hmm.
They've really made great efforts over the years to have as much strategic sovereignty and freedom to act as possible as well. So I wonder what would have to change to again make Indonesia think again about how it does its foreign policy and whether it wants to join a grouping other than ASEAN.
Certainly. And in fact, with Indonesia's commitment towards, developing infrastructure in the nation, and China coming in and developing a lot of that for them, as well as, other Western countries, it would be really, really hard for Indonesia to, decide one way or the other. That's what I think. But I know if there's anybody else who might want to take a stab at this question over there. All right. Okay, so I think we are close to gathering everybody's closing thoughts on the panel discussion. And while I invite you to deliver your closing, I want to ask a larger, question about how these security alliances or how these broader frameworks for international cooperation can be solidified. Do you think that it is important for international cooperation to have a security underpinning? Was it deliberate, or will it be necessary for Quad countries to always have this sort of a mainstream security agenda at the fore, and then cooperation on other ends? And does cooperation on other grounds, in addition to the mainstream security agenda, play any role in strengthening the alliance? Just closing thoughts on this, and if there's anything else that you'd like to comment on. So let me invite Anastasia first, and then Lydia, Jasmine, and Lauren.
Sure. I think, at least personally, I think that we do need to get better at cooperating if we're going to face both the traditional and non-traditional security threats of the next 20 years. We need to increase our capacity for cooperation. Cooperation is expensive. It demands lots of resources. It demands certain types of people who can do it properly. Real investment in diplomacy, which for most Quad countries has been in retreat over the last 20 years. So I would encourage Quad countries to really think hard about reinvesting in politics and cooperation, both in terms of the Quad grouping, but also throughout the region too.
Absolutely. And I think, one point that you brought forward, which is hard for many people to appreciate, is that cooperation is also hard, and it has its limits. It has costs attached to it, and that's also something that people need to think hard about. But over to Lydia now.
Yes, I would like to pull that thread on how it is time-consuming and requires a lot of resources to do the cooperation, and say that I think that because of that, having alliances that are not very formalized is a very good approach, because that allows freedom of maneuver to make it what you want when you need it to be, without those rigid rules that constrain your actions. And so I think that that's something that we need to keep thinking about, because we're going to be experiencing more change in technology than we have ever experienced in our humanity's history. And that changes paradigms in the way we interact. And regarding your comment about security, I think that there are many instruments of power. The military is one of them, but there's also the economic and the diplomatic, and the cultural aspect. So we should think about all of those together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lydia. And I think that, the value of informal alliances could be a great research agenda and a great title for a book, perhaps sometime. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thanks. Yes. I think great points made by Anastasia and Lydia right now. I think, yes, there's a little bit of a tough road to walk on when we're looking at, the balance between hard power and soft power. Inherently, power and national security associated with that has dominantly been that push factor that I just alluded to. It will be interesting to see, again, the whole angle around climate change and that being sort of an existential crisis, for many countries to come, but and how that essentially kind of informs a lot of the decision making from a hard power perspective, but also kind of fits within the whole national security agenda. I still have a strong sense that issues around national security will remain that push factor and will drive some of these in terms of formal decision making. But most certainly, collaborative efforts around economic benefits will continue to kind of be the cherry on the cake.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Jasmine. And Lauren, over to you.
Well, first, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for insight. Put a good word on it here. I think that the Quad security agenda has been informed by other actors in the region largely, and I think that as far as those evolutions of the region go, that will remain the case insofar as that agenda is needed. But I do think that this year shown that crises such as the COVID crisis can inform a great deal of evolution in terms and expansion of scope of that agenda. I hope to see more of that going forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. And with this, we come to a close of this fascinating discussion. I hope that we get a chance to discuss this in greater detail in the future. But for today, thank you so much, Anastasia, Lydia, Jasmine, and Lauren. It has been a pleasure to host you for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.